We've come a long way through the book of Acts. We only have 2 chapters to go. What an exciting journey. But there's more to come in this episode of The Prophetic Connection. As we near the end of the book of Acts, and certainly the end of Paul's life and ministry, let's remember again what God said to Ananias, that servant at Damascus that he sent to find Saul, who became Paul. He said, I have chosen this man that he will suffer for my name's sake. Now, as we near the end of the book of Acts, we see that those words have come true, for Paul has suffered. But now we understand why God chose Saul, who became Paul in the first place. He needed a man with the intellect, the ability, the background, if you like, as a Jew, a zealous Jew at that, to take the message of God's love to the Gentile world. He found that man in Paul the Apostle. He knew he'd remain faithful to the end, that every opportunity Paul would declare his faith in his God, the God of Israel, but in his Son, Jesus of Nazareth.
As we have already seen in earlier episodes, Paul remained a prisoner at the Roman port city of Caesarea under 2 successive governors, Felix and Festus, before whom he had pleaded his innocence to the religious accusations the Jerusalem elite had leveled against him. In fact, on several occasions, these religious leaders had demonstrated their determination to silence Paul, preferably by killing him or having him killed. It was well known that 40 would-be assassins had already vowed to do so. This is why the Roman commander at Jerusalem, upon hearing of this plot and discovering that Paul was a Roman citizen, moved Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea under cover of darkness and the protection of a large military escort. Paul's time at Caesarea gave him several opportunities to tell his story, not only to Felix and Festus, but also to King Agrippa, who, with his wife Bernice, had come to Caesarea to meet Festus, the newly appointed governor. Festus decided that King Agrippa should have the final say where Paul was concerned, since the king was Rome's most senior official in Judea. Paul seems to have welcomed the chance to share the good news of Christ with the king, but he wisely began by telling the king he viewed him as an expert in all customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Paul told the king about his Jewish upbringing, personal training as a Pharisee, and his well-known zeal for Judaism. But he also told him about his encounter with the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. Paul's story impressed the king to the extent that he was prepared to set him free, but for his appeal to plead his case in Caesar's court.
Now Agrippa said that, Paul, if you hadn't appealed to Rome, I would have set you free, but Paul had appealed to go to Caesar and get justice as a Roman citizen.
Caesarea was a large Roman port city on the coast of Israel. Herod the Great oversaw its expansion and the design of its harbor in particular, so it became one of Rome's premier Mediterranean port cities. It was also the seat of Roman power in the Holy Land, where Roman governors resided and held court. This is why Paul was kept there as a prisoner until King Agrippa ultimately decided his fate. Agrippa ruled that Paul was innocent of all charges, but that he nevertheless must be sent to Rome since he had claimed this right as a Roman citizen. Paul would get his day in court, but it would be in Caesar's court in Rome.
Caesarea or Caesarea was the legal center that was, of that time. And actually, I'm sure that there's filming to see the scenery But Caesarea now is an archaeological site. Of course, it's got a lot of restaurants and other things for the tourists. I like going there. But it was a major port. And of course, Jerusalem is up in the mountains. So, it was not a port in the least. And Caesarea was the major governmental center. So it makes sense that he would be sent from Caesarea to Rome.
As we saw in Acts chapter 26, Agrippa believed that Paul was innocent. Indeed, he told Festus Paul might have been set free had he not appealed to Caesar.
Paul was sent to Rome from Caesarea because the Roman governor and King Agrippa agreed that he should be sent to Caesar and that this should be decided in Rome. Basically, it's like an appeal to the Supreme Court. This is the final appeal, and as a citizen, he has that right, and so he's going to Rome. They sent him.
The irony in this story is that Paul survived the religious and political storms brewing in Jerusalem and Caesarea, only to face a natural storm at sea. The Mediterranean in late autumn was known for its tempestuous seas, better known as Euroclydons or typhoons. As the voyage continued from port to port, Paul became increasingly aware of the likelihood of bad weather. In fact, he had warned the centurion of the dangers that lay ahead. However, as the text records, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. But what did the ship's crew do to survive the storm?
We're fast forwarding to the storm when Paul is on the ship, and he's in the process of being taken to Rome from the Mediterranean coast of Israel, and they had to actually throw the equipment of the ship overboard. It says the tackle. It's kind of inconceivable. It's like basically they were saying, okay, we have to lighten the load. I don't remember if it talks about food and supplies, but it would stand to reason, because in order for a ship to make a trip of that distance, they would have to have a lot of supplies. They had to have food. They had to take fresh water. The Mediterranean is a salt sea, and so basically it was a radical step.
This was really quite a storm on the Mediterranean Sea, and we do have storms like that in the wintertime. First of all, they took down the sails, they allowed the ship to just be driven along. Then when it got worse, they jettisoned the cargo, then they jettisoned the running gear, then they threw out the food, and then finally they tried to escape on their own. So the crew did everything that they knew to try to escape the storm.
Why did an angel appear and stand beside Paul?
An angel came and stood beside Paul to encourage him and tell him that he was in the center of God's will and that he would end up in Rome, and also that all the people on the boat, if they stuck with him, they would also be saved.
This must have been an incredible experience for Paul. An angel comes, stands next to him while this storm is happening, and it was obviously to reassure him, to give him faith, and then to give him a message for all the ship's crew that you will not be destroyed if you follow the directions. Nobody is to try to escape, and we need to stay together. Basically, the angel is saying, hey, Paul, I'm giving you God's assurance that you're going to get through this.
Paul survives political and religious storms, only to face a natural storm in the form of a typhoon. He almost loses his life at sea, but is reassured by the appearance of an angel who tells him that he and all the members of the crew will survive the storm, but be shipwrecked on an island. Why? Because God has already ordained that Paul must be brought before Caesar.
Isaiah gave a prophecy, and I'm going to quote it in a moment, having to do with the response of our people to God's voice, to God's messengers. And Paul basically is saying, look, I was sent by God. We remember that Isaiah was sent by God. This is a holy concept. We ourselves also, my dear friends, brothers and sisters, are sent of God. We won't always be received And that's difficult to deal with. Paul had a capacity to respond even when people were not agreeing with him, even when they weren't receiving his message. And so here's what he said, quoting Isaiah: "Hearing you will hear and not understand. Seeing you will see but not receive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull. Their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes have closed, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn so that I should heal them." I hear a heartbreak in Paul quoting this. He could not have quoted it with anger. I don't think he quoted it with resentment. I think he was relating, and the text tells us that he spent 2 years preaching the kingdom of God in Rome. I know that his heart was broken whenever, especially his people, any people, but especially the Jewish people, were not receiving the message. But he laid the groundwork for us to be here today. I come back to this point. We are the heirs of the ministry of Paul. Shaul was his name in Hebrew, and that name means asked of God. And so the question is being asked here in Tel Aviv. What's the meaning of life? What is life all about? Tel Aviv is seeking action. It's called the city that never sleeps. People are here. They're looking in the pubs. They're looking in homosexuality. They're looking in all kinds of extremes. What are we here for? What's this about? And our brother Paul, Shaul, gave the answer 2,000 years ago, and that answer has not changed.
God had predetermined that, against all odds, Paul, his chosen apostle to the Gentiles, would complete his mission on earth before he was finally summoned home to heaven from Rome. Don't go away. After this short break, Dr. John Tweedy returns with his teaching.
I've chosen this backdrop for chapter 27 because I want to place you within the chapter. Paul is about to leave Caesarea, the port city on the coast, and set sail for Rome. Behind me you can see what remains of the ancient harbor at Caesarea, which was one of King Herod's crowning achievements. I mean, naval architects today still study the design of this harbor and how Herod had it arranged. But you can see the ruins, and because the harbor itself has been hit by several earthquakes down through the centuries. So Paul was here for at least 2 years, where he appeared before the governor Felix, then Festus, and then we saw he appeared before King Agrippa. So it was decided that he would go to Rome for final trial and judgment. So as chapter 27 opens, we read these words. "And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment." So he was under the centurion's guard and protection, as it were. "So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coasts of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. And the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, this is the centurion, treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. When we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, which of course is an island in the Mediterranean, because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia." So you can see what's happening. Ships of the ancient world sort of hopscotched across the oceans, and they had to think about the weather, and the last thing they wanted to do was to be caught in a typhoon, or we would say in the West, a hurricane at sea. So they were very much vulnerable to the changing elements in the times of year. And so they'd go from port to port, and in fact, If someone was trying to get to Rome, they wouldn't board a ship in Caesarea that would take them directly to Italy. They would have to change ships along the way and find other ships that would be taking them in the proper direction, their final destination, as it were. So verse 6, there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship, meaning a ship from Alexandria in Egypt, sailing to Italy. So there's the switch taking place. And he put us on board. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salome. So these are islands in the Aegean Sea, so they've moved out of the Mediterranean, and now they're getting closer to Rome, but they're still among the Greek islands. Passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lasea. Now when much time had been spent, and sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was already over. I suspect this might have been a reference to Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, when the Jews would fast. And of course, it's getting late in the year, and in the fall of the year, then the Mediterranean was a more dangerous place to be. And so I think that's what's being alluded to here. So Paul is really advising them. He's conscious of the fact that to be at sea during this time of year is much more dangerous. So look at what he says in verse 10. Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship, because time is money in business, and so obviously this is coming into play, and they can't afford to waste any more time. Money is at stake. And so then by the things spoken by Paul. So Paul was overruled, and when they really should have listened to him. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also. Paul was outvoted, that's what that means. If by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. So that's what ancient mariners were forced to do. They had to take shelter during the more dangerous times of the year, because to put to sea was to be shipwrecked, and they understood that much. And then in verse 13, when the wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon, and that's really another word for typhoon. In the Mediterranean, it would be called a typhoon. In the West, we would speak of it as a hurricane, but tempestuous seas. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. They didn't have any other choice. The winds were contrary, and they just have to let the ship run with the wind and really hope and pray for the best. And verse 16, and running onto the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. So I understand what was happening. The skiff would usually be pulled behind the ship, but when the seas are tempestuous, then the skiff is banging into the ship. So the only solution was either to cut it loose, and it was really a longboat they needed to get to shore, or bring it on board. So they bring it on board. Verse 17. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship. So now they're strengthening the hull so it doesn't break apart with the force of the waves. And fearing lest they should run aground on the citrus sand, so this was obviously shallow water or shoals that they needed to avoid, they struck sail and so were driven. Now this is an exciting story at sea, as if Paul has not been through enough. This is the last thing that he needed, but that's the way of the disciple. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. So you know they're desperate when they're throwing their cargo overboard, because that's the means of income, but they had to do it. On the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. So they're being forced to make decisions they would rather not make, but it's a matter of life or death for survival. Now, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. After so many days, they resigned themselves to the fact they were going to be lost at sea. And then in verse 21, but after a long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss," meaning the island of Crete, which ironically is where Titus became a bishop. Verse 22, "And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve." Imagine, God's angel stood by Paul, saying, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island." We know from history that the island was Malta, and in Malta today there is a place called St. Paul's Bay, which, according to the tradition, that's where the ship ran aground and where these mariners and Paul came ashore. Now, reading on, verse 27, "Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea," so they've moved out of the Aegean Sea then to the other side, and where Italy is, the other side of Italy in that sense. "About midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land." Verse 28, "And they took soundings," meaning they were testing the depth, "and found it to be 20 fathoms or 120 feet. So they had lots of room. And when they'd gone a little farther, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. So you can see that the water's becoming more shallow as they go. "Then fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come." So they were going to wait it out in that spot until they could see what was in front of them. Anyway, we continue reading on, and I'll jump some verses. This is a long chapter. And then we read in verse 38, "So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea." So they're not done yet. They're still lightening the ship. "When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach, onto which they planned to run the ship, if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea, meanwhile loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore." So as we can see, the situation was still precarious. But as we will also see, while the ship was lost, the crew survived along with Paul, because Paul was God's servant and he needed to get to Rome. More after this very short break. As we saw just before the break, Paul's situation, the situation of the ship and crew, was precarious because they're still in the midst of the storm and they're not yet on the land. And then we read in verse 41, "But striking a place where 2 seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast," meaning the front of the ship or the bow, "and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves." So the danger remains. Then we read, "And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape," because we understand that if they escape, then the soldiers themselves could be put to death for allowing that to happen. Anyway, but the centurion, wanting to save Paul, and we would have to say that God placed that particular centurion over Paul in this circumstance. The centurion kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to the land, and the rest, some on boards, some on parts of the ship, and so it was that they all escaped safely to land. So as I said earlier, just from the description we find here and from the tradition, This was Malta, and they landed in this bay where the two seas met, really sort of a peninsula with seas meeting on either side at that point or that place. Now, in the very next episode, the last episode, we'll see that even a viper's deadly bite could not stop Paul from his destiny at Rome.
Thanks for watching today's episode. Join us next time for Mission Accomplished.